Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Storytime, we ride the stories of the West Campfire truths, trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty humans, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Rust Ridge, Colorado Territory, April 13, 1884. Evening rode in with a chill that tasted of metal and wet clay. Lanterns swung on iron hooks. Coffee boiled dark in a tin kettle. The square carried the scrape of boots, the click of spurs, the sweet bite of leather, and the steady wet complaint of wagon wheels. Nora Hale stood near the auction plank with her hands inside frayed gloves. 23. Bonnet tied tight under her jaw, hair the color of hickory tucked clean, not a strand offered to the wind. Breath rose white in front of her face and was gone. Virgil Hale, her father, shook the last pennies in his palm and set a little pouch down where deals lived and died. He spoke like he was selling a saddle with a cracked tree. Useful, he said. She can cook men to keep a house from slipping. He paused. She cannot bear children. A ripple moved through the square. Men looked sideways. Women pulled little ones behind skirts. Someone laughed too loud, then stopped when the sound did not catch. Nora watched the boards under her boots gloss with mud. The word Barren did not land. It had already settled years ago and built a small, cold room inside her that no one saw. From the back of the crowd, a man stepped forward. Broad shoulders under a plain coat, hat brim stained with rain. His face was sun-cut and honest, the kind that did not ask for a better truth than the one given. Jonah Mercer of Blue Mesa Ranch. Folks knew the name, widower, keeper of fences, not much for company. Not. He set a canvas sack beside the pouch. The coins inside spoke in a lower voice. He looked at Virgil, then at the space just to the left of Nora's face, as if not to pin her with his eyes. "I need someone who stays," he said. Virgil weighed the sack with his hand like he wanted to test gravity. The world felt very simple on that plank. Nora lifted her head. Jonah did not smile. He gave a small nod that meant this would not be pretty, and it would not be loud, but it would hold. The bidding did not happen. The square adjusted around the decision the way water finds a rut. Virgil nodded once. The pouch made a tired sound when he picked it up. Jonah turned and walked toward a bay gelding tied at the rail. He did not look back. He did not ask. He spoke once quiet, close enough that the words belonged to her alone. "If you are willing to stay." Nora touched the edge of her bonnet and felt the cotton grit against her fingers. Willing, not traded. She followed him, skirts lifting out of the mud. They passed the general store window, a low peg loose on a board wall hung by a single nail. A child height peg. The screw swayed and stilled. They rode out on the Mesa Road. Sage woke under the hoofbeats. Coyotes called from the dry ravine. Nora watched the horizon cut the sky like a blade and thought about rooms with windows and doors that opened when she pushed. Blue Mesa Ranch stood above a creek that was mostly rock this time of year. The house had the strict beauty of something built to outlast storms. 2 stories. Timbers dark with oil. A porch that did not invite rocking so much as waiting. Wind ran through the grass and left ladders of shadow behind it. The front door creaked. An older woman stood framed in the gap, hair gray and tight, shawl crossed neat over bone, eyes that made a measure not a welcome. "Mother," Jonah said. "This is Nora. She will be living here." "Living," Agnes Mercer said. "For what?" "To help," Jonah answered. Agnes looked at the mud on Nora's hem and the clean line of her jaw. Her mouth moved like she was tasting the word living and finding it too soft. She turned and let the door swing wide. Inside smelled of soap lamp oil iron. There were no pictures on the walls, no pins stuck into quilts with names stitched to the corners. The mantel held a small brass music box with a chipped lid and a cross that had lost its chain. The parlor chair by the window angled to face nothing in particular. It was a tidy absence. Jonah led her down the hall past a row of pegs set low on a board. The wood was worn smooth, where small hands had reached again and again, but the pegs were empty. He stopped at a narrow room with clean sheets folded in a careful square and a single chair. A window looked toward the creek. The glass hummed a little in the wind. "This used to be for guests," he said. "You will find what you need." He stood in the doorway like he might say something else. Then he stepped away and came back with a flannel coat soft from years with a line of faded floral stitching along the hem. "My wife wore this when winter bit. Thought you might." Nora touched the cloth. It was warm from his hands. "Thank you," she said. "You are not here to replace anyone," Jonah said. "I will not ask that." He left. Nora sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress knew how to hold a body without showing off about it. She listened to the quiet, not empty, just careful. The house spoke in small ways. A floorboard near the stove held a squeak. The back door breathed when it closed. Somewhere a clock ticked in the kitchen and slipped a beat every hour. She rose, crossed the hall, and set her hand on the low peg rail. It fit her palm like it belonged to someone younger. She took a square handkerchief from her pocket and hung it there because hanging it felt like saying a name without starting a fight. On the porch, the wind pushed in with the smell of snow still tucked into the high shadow places. A single aspen stood beside the steps, thin and white-scarred leaves the size of thumbnails trembling even when the air seemed to rest. The tree did not ask permission to tremble. It simply did. Agnes watched from the kitchen doorway. "You do not smile much," she said. Nora kept her eyes on the aspen. "Not part of the work," she said. Agnes made a small sound in her throat. "No one else would have you." Nora did not look at her. She felt the sentence touch and slide off. She went back to the room, folded the flannel coat across the chair, and sat again as the light thinned and blue slid into the corners. When full dark came, she lit the little lamp on the bedside table and turned down the wick until the flame balanced in a small, brave oval. Her boots came off slow. The floor was cold and honest. She bent to pull the quilt, and her fingers brushed something wrapped in cloth tucked under the bed frame. She reached and drew out a smooth river stone that still held heat. Someone had warmed it for her and put it there without knocking. Nora set the stone at her feet under the quilt. The heat crept into her bones in thin lines and eased the jaw she had kept clenched all day. The quiet settled like a blanket. A cough sounded down the hall, Jonah not trying to hide it. The old house answered with a creak and a shiver in the window. Nora stood and walked to the mantel in the front room. The brass music box waited with its lid crooked from a fall years back. Her thumb found the key and turned. The spring caught. The tune began bright and simple, a child's lullaby that someone had chosen long ago. On the third bar, the cylinder snagged on a bent tooth, and the song stopped on a high note that hung and would not resolve. The room held its breath. Nora pressed the lid gently with 2 fingers and listened to that single silver thread of sound thin and thin until it disappeared. She closed the box. The quiet that followed was not the same as the one before. It was heavier. It fit closer to the skin. She stood there, a long time, lamp warm against her wrist, the river stone working under the quilt in the other room. Outside, the aspen leaves touched each other and made a soft coin sound. The clock in the kitchen slipped its beat. Nora drew the bolt on the door and blew the lamp low. She lay down with her boots tucked under the bed where the stone had been. The mattress held. The house held. The night leaned in and listened. Somewhere a horse stamped in its stall. Somewhere the creek talked to stones. Nora kept her eyes open until the window turned a deep slate. Then the music she had not heard finished itself inside her head and ended on a clean note she could keep. Morning brought a pale square of light to the floorboards, and the wind carried the smell of iron rain still trapped in the far ridges. The house woke in small noises, a pan set on the stove, the faint cluck of hens somewhere behind the shed. Boots moved across the porch and dropped to the lower step with a patient thud. Nora tied her hair and went to the yard with a pail. The air bit her fingers and then gave them back when the sun found the line of the fence. Feathers dusted the hen house door. She scooped grain, the soft rattle of it calming the birds, and held her breath when one brave hen pecked near her wrist. The hen blinked as if deciding, then settled to eating. The decision felt like a small treaty. Agnes stood at the kitchen threshold with a cloth over her shoulder and an expression as neat as a folded sheet. "You have an early start," she said. Nora kept her eyes on the pail. "It is quieter then," she said. "Quieter for what?" "Forgetting the measure of things." Agnes wiped the same spot on the door frame twice as if the wood might give a different answer the second time. She went inside without replying. The door breathed shut behind her. The barn breathed dust when Nora slid the big door. Moted light knifed in and floated a slow storm. Bales stacked along the far wall, a rickety ladder to a loft that had once held more than hay. The space above felt like a throat clearing. She climbed hand by hand, feeling splinters press and release. Up top the boards warmed in the sun and held the smell of old summer. She sat on a crate and looked around. The air seemed to listen. She began with what was in reach. A gunny sack clapped clean and folded into cushions. Crates stood on end for stools. An iron nail lifted from a beam became a hook. From the corner she dragged a length of slate left behind by someone who liked the feel of chalk. She brushed it with her sleeve, and a cloud rose that smelled of limestone and thyme. The first day the children did not arrive at once, as if the idea had to discover itself. A small boy in a shirt too big came and stood without crossing the threshold. A girl with a crow feather in her hair took 3 steps and waited. Nora wrote a letter on the slate with chalk that squeaked. The sound frightened the boy. He laughed when she made the chalk sing on purpose. "Name," she said. He traced an H in the dust with his finger. She guided his hand and let the line wobble. Another child appeared like a field mouse, then another. They sat on crates, more breath than voice. They traced words into a shallow pan of ash with sticks. Nora read from a tattered reader she found in a chest by the stove, the paper thin and almost see-through. The story had a horse that ran to the end of the world and back. The children leaned in and watched her mouth. When noon came, they scattered without noise and did not take the chalk with them. Nora stood alone in that light and felt that some part of the house had opened a door and would see if she could keep it from slamming. Jonah said nothing about the loft. He returned later than the light would like, led the bay gelding to the rail, and stood with his back to the yard. He looked outward, not up. He left a small sack of nails on the barn step and a length of smooth board against the wall. He spoke to the gelding and not to her. The next morning there were wagon tracks arcing wider than the usual path looping past the Higgins place where 2 Beck boys lived with no father at home. That afternoon 2 boys with the same ears and the same stubborn eyebrows sat on the crates and did not admit how far they had walked. In the kitchen Nora burned a tray of biscuits. She had watched the letters so close that the fire taught its own lesson. The smell hit first bitter like a wrong hour. Smoke flattened itself along the ceiling and sought all the places a roof gives up. Agnes lifted a damp towel without a word, swung its slow eyes on the edges of the pan where butter had turned black and glassy. Nora pulled the tray and carried it outside. The cold caught the smoke and wrung it out. Jonah came past with a bridle over his shoulder. He stopped at the porch where the biscuits sat in their ruin. Nora braced for a correction she already knew by heart. He looked at the tray, then at her hands red from heat and ash. He said, "Better a burnt biscuit than a burnt person." He reached and turned one biscuit over with a finger as if it had a second chance on the other side. Then he lifted the bridle again and went to the corral. Nora had trouble knowing what to do with the words after they landed, so she washed the pan and set it to dry and made stew, as if stew could carry a thought the way bread carries butter. When Jonah sat at the table that night, he ate like a man who knew how to work quietly. Agnes ate with small, neat bites. No one said the word biscuit. The room contained the word anyway. The next morning, whispers collected like chaff in corners. At the mercantile, women looked over Nora's shoulder instead of into her eyes, as if their gaze might touch something that could climb back. At the barber, a man said something about mules and returns and smiled in a way that did not involve his mouth. In the churchyard, a voice low behind a hymn said she is teaching other people's children because she cannot make her own. The voice had the regret of someone enjoying what he was not supposed to enjoy. The children knew it first. They moved like deer, that sense of fence where there is only a shadow. A girl came, then stopped at the edge of the yard and plucked at her sleeve where a mother had sewn a firm line. 2 boys arrived and looked back over their shoulders as if an order might catch them from behind. They backed away and did not come. The loft that had throbbed with small breath while they sounded out the long E in Creek made a sound like a room that remembers noise. Nora sat on a crate with the slate in her lap and listened to the light change from white to gold. She put her palm on the board where hands had rubbed it smooth and felt the memory of small fingers. She lifted her hand and saw her own palm print in dust, and that looked like a signature without ink. She blew the dust away. Agnes found her later at the sink. Sleeve's wet hair slipped from its tie. Agnes set a cup in the rack and said in a voice you could cut bread with, "The town is not built to take on every stray sorrow." Nora did not answer. She dried the cup twice. She folded the towel exactly and hung it on a peg. Then she went outside to where the aspen stood with its leaves trembling like coins in a pocket. The tree made a sound that was not quite music and not quite talk. Toward late afternoon, Nora took the footpath to Rust Creek with a bolt of muslin under her arm and a small sack of salt. The shortcut cut the distance but also peeled away the sight lines. Dry Fork ran low that time of year, a slick of water over round stones that clicked against each other in the shallows. At the little bridge, a man leaned on the rail and held a bottle by the neck. His coat wore its stains like medals, and his beard had forgotten a comb. He lifted his head and grinned, as if remembering an old joke he had not earned the right to tell. "Well now," he said, "if it is not the one they tossed. Mercer pick you up like a stray, did he?" Nora stopped with the sack pressed under her arm until her ribs felt it. The bottle showed a wet mouth where it had slept between drinks. The man stepped off the rail. His boots left a dark mark on the plank, and the mark bulged like a bruise. He came one step too close. "Do not say a word," he said. "I just wanted to look at the one not woman enough to keep a man twice." The creek talked under the planks. A bird cut the air and changed its mind mid-flight. Nora kept her feet where they were and the name of the road in her mouth in case she needed to say it. Rust Ridge. She thought of the peg rail with the handkerchief and how small cloth can carry a name. Hoofbeats sounded up the path, the kind that eat distance and do not give it back. Jonah slid down from the bay without hurry. He did not look at the man. He came to Nora first and lifted the sack of salt from under her arm to see if her hands opened clean. He looked at her eyes the way a person checks if a lantern still holds flame. Then he turned, gathered the reins, and held them toward her. "Come on," he said. She climbed up. He mounted behind, and the saddle leather recognized them both. His coat gave off a heat that did not belong to the sun. They rode without talk until the fence corner of Blue Mesa came into view, and the bay lifted its head as if happy for the idea of water. "People talk when they are scared," Jonah said. Nora watched a hawk draw a figure on the sky and erase it in the same stroke. She did not answer. "You understand what I need," he said. "That is more than any of them ever did." She did not turn, but she let her shoulder find the line of his chest, the smallest fraction. The creek widened. The house caught the light along the porch rails like a string of coins. It rained that night without waiting to be asked. At first, the sound was a soft counting on the roof, then a steady hand that pushed. The smell of wet sage rolled through the yard, and the chickens made a muttering that was almost content. Nora lay awake and felt the river stone under the quilt hold heat against her feet, as if the day before had saved some warmth for this. By noon the next day the rain came in sheets, and the fields took it the way dry mouths take water. Mud shouldered into the ruts and grew their edges. The loft sighed where boards swelled. Nora moved the crates back from the worst drips and folded the gunny sacks twice. She went to the old tool shed behind the barn, a squat building with a door that did not trust its hinges. A pile of warped crates leaned like a tired man. The smell inside was cedar and mouse and iron. She swept the floor with a branch broom until a patch of wood showed through, and the act of clearing cleared more than dust. She patched a hole in the roof with a piece of tarp and 2 nails left on a windowsill. The sound of rain softened and became a drum farther away. In the far corner sat a wooden chest, low and wide, the color of old coffee with brass that had forgotten how to shine. A strip of leather hung where a handle had been. The latch was rusted to the shape of closed. Nora wiped her hands on her skirt and knelt. She tried the latch with 2 fingers. It held like a jaw. She braced her knee and tugged once, then twice. The rust reconsidered and powder fell like brown snow. The latch gave with a sound that belonged to secrets learning a new air. Nora lifted her hand and touched the lid where years had smoothed it. Rain ticked on the patched roof. Somewhere a horse shook itself, and the harness bells made the smallest noise. She set her fingers under the lid and began to lift. The lid lifted with a sigh that felt older than the shed. Cedar breathed out, cool and sweet, threaded with the faint bite of iron where nails had slept. Inside lay folded linens the color of a winter cloud, a small clutch of letters ribbon-tied and foxed at the edges, and one book that had kept its dignity. Leather dark as old coffee corners rubbed smooth the title pressed in gilt that still held a dull light. Mercer Homestead Ledger. Nora brushed her thumb across the word until heat woke under the skin. She set the book on her knees and let the weight of it find her. When she opened to the front, the ink rose clean and steady names and dates, births and deaths, those who came for supper, and never left those who went before the pie cooled. Pages turned with a dry whisper. There were calves and crops in a different hand, then a return to family, a shift back to pulse and breath. Close to the back, the handwriting changed again. Jonah Mercer joined to Martha Pike a June wedding. Later that winter, Thomas Mercer born, and on the same line a second date that closed the circle. A small cross tucked beside his name, as if someone could make sorrow polite. Below a space had been left for air, and there in a darker stroke someone had drawn a line that canceled the promise. Another line had crossed the first, as if the first refusal needed refusing. Rain deepened on the shed roof, a new tempo over the steady drum. Nora reached for the pocket where she kept a pencil stub, then stopped. The blank space beneath air looked like a field under snow waiting for tracks. She put the pencil back closed. The book smoothed the leather. "Not yet," she said without sound. By evening, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The creek ran louder, talking in a language that seemed pleased with itself. Jonah rode in dark, with rain sewn into his coat. Water fell off the brim of his hat and strings. He leaned the bay into the stall, and did not stand upright quite as quick as he meant to. When he came into the kitchen, the heat caught him hard. He set his hands on the table to steady what would not steady on its own. Agnes watched him with a look that knew the difference between tired and sick. She set a basin on the table and said nothing. Jonah nodded without looking at anyone. He lifted his hands to unbutton his cuffs and missed the button. Nora reached and found it for him, fingers, quick eyes on the thread. His skin was hot to the touch, not the good heat from labor, the wrong kind that writes under the skin. She moved the lamp closer, the flame a coin on his cheekbone. He did not sit at the table. He went to bed as if bed were a gate that needed climbing. In his room the window sang in the wind, and the quilt kept its shape even when he did not. Nora wrung cloths in water that had clouded with heat and cooled them on his forehead, then his wrists, then the inside of his elbows where blood runs near the skin. The ledger lay on the small table near the bed. She set it there with a careful hand open to the page that held the crossed line. She placed a pen across the margin like a bridge. The house turned quiet in a new way. The clock in the kitchen slipped and corrected itself. The rain softened toward morning as if the sky were too tired to argue. Agnes came and went with a teapot like an extra heart. Nora kept her seat and kept the cloths moving. She did not pray out loud. She watched the breath in Jonah's chest when the fever shifted and took a step back, then forward again, a stubborn dancer. When the lamp stuttered, she trimmed the wick with a steady hand that did not look like hers. It was gray outside when he opened his eyes. The room had that washed look of hours that have not decided whether to count. Jonah turned his head toward the table. He saw the book before he saw Nora. He considered something, then sat up slow, a man counting ribs. His hand found the pen and rested there as if feeling the weight would tell him what the ink could not. He wrote in a script that was not quite straight. Norakin by keeping chosen still. He set the pen down like a tool put back in its place and leaned his head against the headboard with his eyes closed. Nora read the line and felt it plant itself somewhere that had been salt for a long time. The rain stopped. The roof ticked as if the boards were remembering their own dry shape. When Agnes came with tea, she did not comment on the book. She poured and pushed the cup nearer the bed until the steam curled under Jonah's breath. The sun made a thin coin in the window by late morning. The yard glistened a world rinsed. Jonah shaved that afternoon and stood up without help, although he touched the wall on his way down the hall as if the house were a friend who required proof. Nora went to the porch and watched the aspen shake off the last of the drops. The leaves clapped their small applause and then settled as if they had agreed to speak only when the wind had earned the listening. 2 days later, a rider came out of Rust Ridge with a satchel marked with the county stamp. The horse sweated along the neck, and the man's coat wore more dust than rain. He handed over 3 envelopes and a folded handbill. Jonah signed the paper that wanted to name the good kind of surrender. The rider tipped the brim and went off at a sober walk, the hooves clapping in a rhythm the porch boards could not quite match. The envelope in Jonah's hand felt official just by being itself. He slid it with a thumbnail and read eyes moving faster, then slower. He folded it clean and left it on the kitchen table. The paper sat there a while like an extra place set for supper. Agnes moved around it twice without touching. Nora finished shelling peas and carried the bowl to the sink. She wiped her palms on her apron as if to dry something that water had not touched. When she read the letter, the words lined themselves in tidy rows that still managed to ask for more than they pretended. Verification of land ownership required for property records update. Please confirm legal names of sole or joint proprietors. If married, indicate name of legal spouse. Return by the date listed below. She put the paper back where she found it. That evening, the 3 of them sat with plates that lifted steam when the lamplight hit them stew and bread simple as a bell. Jonah set the letter between himself and Nora. His voice stayed low, almost casual, as if they were deciding when to bring in wood before frost. I do not need anyone's name on that land to know it is ours, he said. If you want yours, there write it. No preacher needed. Agnes cut the bread and did not look up. Nora felt the pencil in her pocket by habit. The thought of it felt like something that could burn through cloth if she pressed too hard. She picked up the county form and found the line that had been drawn for spouse. The space weighted generous, a little smug. Her eyes moved to the section lower where a second option shrugged its quiet shoulder. Joint proprietor. She wrote her name on the line. Nora Hale. Co-owner by choice, not by blood. The words looked exposed in their newness. She pushed the page back across the table. Jonah nodded once the kind of nod a man uses when a fence post sits true. They ate the stew before it went cold. The lamp made a soft clicking sound inside itself. Morning light came up clean. The letter was gone from the table. Nora would have thought no more of it if not for the new thing on the kitchen wall after noon. Between the window and the calendar, a small wooden frame had appeared. The county form sat inside it, pressed flat the ink, a shade darker, where her hand had hovered too long. The frame had been rubbed with oil and smelled of pine when she stood close. Most folks frame a wedding picture, Jonah said from behind her. We frame the thing that gave us choice. Nora did not turn. She looked at the neat curve of her own letters and felt the odd relief of seeing what cannot be seen most days. She touched the bottom corner of the frame and left no print. The house seemed to accept the new square on the wall, the way a field accepts a new gate. A pause, then a new path worn by passage. The peg rail in the hall remained empty, the lowest pegs smooth from use long ago. The brass music box on the mantel kept its lid straight when Nora set it right with a careful thumb. It played through one short tune once in the afternoon and then fell quiet on its own terms, the note finished and placed. Late day stretched the porch boards into gold. Dust lifted from the yard and turned slow in the air each time a wagon passed on the road beyond the cottonwoods. Nora sat on the step with a bowl in her lap and the sound of peas hitting the bottom like small stones dropped in a pond. The aspen leaves brightened and dimmed as the wind made and unmade its mind. Hooves sounded on the lane, not the tired rhythm of a ranch horse, a fancy 4-beat that said city with every fall. A carriage rolled into view, black lacquer catching the light and refusing it. The wheels bit the gravel with a deliberate crackle. It stopped just past the gate where the road flattens and the yard begins. The door latch clicked precise, followed by the soft pull of a gloved hand finding the handle. The carriage door opened, and a man stepped down careful with the heel of a polished boot on gravel that did not welcome shine. His coat carried a weight of cloth that cost more than the porch was willing to respect. hat brim sharp, gloves pale. He removed them finger by finger and tucked them into his belt as if to show he meant to stay long enough to matter. Nora set the bowl of peas beside her feet. A pea leapt and rolled into the crack between two boards and hid there like a child who knows the rules. Eliza, the man said, then corrected himself without apology. Nora. His voice came dressed in the same town she had left behind. It wore good manners over a thin impatience. Silas Hart, she said. The name was dry in her mouth, as if it had been stored too long. He smiled in a way that asked the porch to admire his teeth. I heard you were here. His eyes traveled the rails, the clean sweep of the yard, the unvarnished truth of the house, and that you were teaching letters to farm children. He reached into his coat and brought out a velvet pouch, the color of a bruise softened by time. He held it open, just enough for light to catch the ring inside. Old gold, a sober stone. For old times, he said, a peace offering. Nora did not reach for it. She could hear the aspen leaves behind her finding each other in the breeze. The sound reminded her of coins, and that did not help. I came to say I was wrong, Silas said. About you, about what a home is. My wife passed last spring. His voice dipped there because voices learn to dip where pity might live. The doctor says I will not have children of my own. He paused, then went on as if the confession granted him a key. I know now blood is not what holds a house. Come back. Be my wife. We can start again. Everything is waiting. The screen door clicked behind Nora. Jonah stood just inside the frame with a hand resting on the edge as if feeling the wood breathe. He did not push through. He did not speak. His presence drew a line across the porch that did not need paint. Nora looked at the pouch, then at the man holding it. Once she would have stepped toward that shine, or at least toward what it promised. The thought of that girl made her throat feel young and unwise. You are late, she said. Silas blinked. Then say yes, he said quietly, lowering the pouch as if lowering his voice would help. Nora felt the frame on the kitchen wall behind her shoulder, the paper that held her name where photographs do not. She pictured the ledger on the table by Jonah's bed with ink drying into the page. She thought of a river stone under a quilt and a hand that warmed it for her without asking for thanks. The man who needed to hear that yes came late, she said. Silas Hart listened to the truth while he searched for the argument that would make it quiet again. He did not find one. The velvet pouch slipped from his fingers and landed soft on the boards. He did not bend to pick it up. Jonah stepped onto the porch and came to stand beside Nora. He set his hand on her shoulder. He faced Silas without adding breath to the air that had already been spent. She was never returned, Jonah said. You cannot take her back. Silas stood without his ring and without his correction. He put his gloves on as if each finger required a thought. He touched the brim of his hat and turned. The carriage wheels found their sound again less certain on the way out than on the way in. Dust rose and found its level. Nora leaned her back to the doorframe and let the air go out of her in one long thread. She did not feel emptied, she felt placed. Weeks turned, and the ridge threw off the last of its frost. Market day brought a sky pale as milk, and a wind that played at being warm without committing. Nora walked the row of stalls with a bolt of muslin held tight under her arm and a list that lived in her head. Eggs, salt, thread. She did not see the dip in the road until her boot found it. The world tilted. The muslin slid. Her breath went smaller than it should. A boy shouted her name and then forgot to finish it. Jonah was already moving from the far end of the street where he had been loading sacks. He cut the distance like water forgets to slow for stones. He gathered her as if she were a task he had always known how to do. She heard the lift of his breath, felt the heat of his coat. She saw the sky straighten and hold. The doctor from the farther ridge came late afternoon, with the gait of a man who trusts his horse and not the roads. The house made room for him without effort. The lamp was lit, though there was still light at the windows, and the clock kept its own counsel. He set his bag down. He opened his hands. He took her pulse and frowned at what he did not need to frown at. The air was full of those little sounds a house makes when it holds itself still. About 11 weeks, he said. Nora turned her face to the ceiling where the plaster had a fine crack that had never learned to be a real problem. They said I could not, she said, and her voice did not ask for anything. Then now you are allowed, the doctor said. He wrote something on a scrap that would not help later and left it on the table anyway. He told Jonah to fetch water when there was already water. He told Agnes to let Nora rest when Nora had already sat down. He left with the light, and his horse found the road without his help. In the days that followed, the yard smelled of wet dirt and new grass. Jonah planted 3 young aspens in a line along the porch spade, biting the earth with a true sound. He set each tree with his hands under the roots like a parent under arms. He called them Shiver Grove without saying it out loud and stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt to watch the leaves learn the wind. Children came back the way birds do when a hawk has passed, not all at once. A little boy left a smooth stone on the rail by the barn, not a gift, just a marker that said he had been there when his feet could not. A girl slid a page torn from a catalog under the shed door, a drawing of a cradle and a price that was too much. The loft held its breath and then let it out in syllables. Nora taught with her hands on the board, chalk dust blooming in light and settling on her cuffs like pollen. She paused more often than she had, and did not apologize for the pause. The children waited with the patience of those who have watched weather. The storm came in from the west with a flat gray line that made its own horizon, then rolled over the first one. Afternoon fell into a darker sort of day. Wind walked the yard and knocked where it did not need to be invited. Rain found the seam in the roof and insisted on being counted. The chickens muttered and went still. Animals know when to concede. Nora felt the first tightness as a question that had an answer ready. She gripped the chair back and stood until standing did not help. Agnes moved as if she had trained for it, and then forgotten that she had. Water boiled. Towels warmed. The bed was turned down like a road without a turn-off. Jonah stood at the window and then at the foot of the bed and then by Nora's side. He set the lamp where it would work the longest and trimmed the wick. His face was calm in the way of people who have already made their choice. "You are not alone," he said. "I stay." The wind pulled at the eaves and the house answered with a long groan. The music box on the mantel sat with its lid closed, a polite little square of brass that knew when to be quiet. The river stone in the oven took heat and gave it back to the bed as if a small son had been hired for night work. Hours rearranged themselves. Pain came and left and returned with a better argument. Nora gripped Jonah's hand and pushed when the room asked it of her. The doctor did not arrive and then did not arrive again. Agnes wiped Nora's forehead and said a name that had not been chosen yet. Jonah kept his hand where hers could find it even when her fingers forgot softness. He counted without numbers. He breathed in time with the sound she made. When the power of it rose higher than talking, the house went very still. The rain leaned into the roof and stayed there. The lamp burned a little lower. Nora felt the world narrow to a ring of light, and the ring moved and then widened, and then broke with a clean honesty that allowed no speech. The sound that followed cut through the rain and the wind and the long listening of the rooms. A cry thin at first, then strong in a way that put weight back into the air. Agnes laughed without planning it. Jonah's shoulders dropped as if someone had taken a sack from him. Nora closed her eyes and felt the softness of a new cheek against her arm, the heat of a small body that knew everything it needed to know for the moment. The baby blinked and found the light with the serious stare of the newly arrived. Brown eyes. Dark hair slicked to a small skull with a perfect whirl that would guide a comb. "She looks like you," Jonah said, voice rough from holding breath. "Brave enough to come where we were afraid to stay." When the quiet settled into its better shape, Jonah went to the table by the window and opened the ledger. He smoothed the page that had once offered air and had been crossed, then crossed again. He dipped the pen, shook one drop, and wrote, "Nora chosen to love and loved enough to give life. Wren Mercer, daughter by faith." He read the words once under his breath and closed the book. The lamp flame steadied. The rain slowed and began to count itself smaller. The wind stepped away from the house and took its argument down the valley to see who else would listen. Jonah laid the pen beside the ledger. He came back to the bed and set a warm stone at the foot where it could do its work. He rested his hand on Nora's hair and then on Wren's back light as a promise kept. The house breathed with them. The trees outside rattled their small coins and then fell quiet. The peg rail in the hall held its empty places without worry. The frame on the kitchen wall caught a bit of lamplight and gave it back. Morning came with a clean light that made the wet yard shine like a new plate. The roof still carried the scar of the hard rain. Jonah climbed the ladder with a bundle of shingle sleeves pushed to the elbow, hands sure. He set his weight careful on the rafters and listened to the house talk back. A hammer rose and fell. Nails went in straight. The sound rang through the ribs of the place like a bell that no one had to ring. Two men from over the ridge walked up without sending word. One brought a coil of tar paper, the other a saw that sang when it bit. They did not shake hands long. They did not take off their hats. They set to. Agnes heated coffee until it scolded the tin and put out a plate of bread and cheese. No thanks were traded. A good day does not need words to prove it happened. By noon, the roof held a new skin. The rainwater that had been collecting in the gutter found its way down the spout as if it had always meant to. Jonah stood on the porch rail and looked along the lines he had made. He sighted down a row of shingles, squinted, and allowed the corner of his mouth to move a fraction. The men left a near-empty roll of tar paper by the door and went off with the same quiet they came with. The tool shed took on a second life once the leaks were gone. Jonah planed boards until curls of pale wood lay around his boots like shavings of light. He rubbed oil into pine shelves and left them to drink. He set benches along the walls, long and low, sanded smooth, where small knees would find them. He hung hooks by the door for coats that had forgotten they could belong to a row. Nora watched from the threshold. Chalk dust lived at the cuffs of her dress like pollen. Wren slept in a basket near the stove with one fist open, as if even rest required a small reach. The room gathered itself around the new edges and liked how they felt. On a Saturday, a sign went up by the shed door. Jonah had carved the letters with a steady wrist. Nora's room, for the kept not the claimed. He hung it with 2 screws and stood back. The words sat plain and right. The children came on Monday with their winter hats still on their heads, even though the air did not demand it. They filed in with the solemnity that play sometimes borrows when it wants to be taken seriously. A boy touched the new shelf and left a print he could not help. A girl traced the sign with a finger and nodded once. The brass music box on the mantel found its tune again. Jonah took it apart with a pocket knife and a patience taught by fences. He lifted the cylinder and bent the tooth back with a touch so light that a breath would have done it if a breath knew where to land. He set the spring, closed the lid, and turned the key. The song ran to the end without hesitation. It finished and did not apologize for finishing. Agnes walked by and did not compliment the work. She set a folded towel on the back of a chair and straightened a candlestick that did not need straightening. Later, when Wren's first cry had become a series of soft questions, Agnes stood in the hall and looked at the peg rail. The lowest peg still held the memory of small hands. She took a knife from her apron and knelt. The knife made a whisper as it moved. The wood gave up curl after curl. When she stood, a new name lived there. Nora. The letters were not fancy. They did not need to be. Agnes put the knife away and went into the kitchen and lifted the lid on the stew to let steam out. She did not look toward the hall again. The ledger took its place on the shelf near the window, where morning could find it without making a ceremony. 2 more names gathered underneath in a smaller hand. Beck for the brothers who never waited to be asked. Ellie for the girl with the crow feather in her hair, who brought words for others when hers were plenty. Not children of the house, but kept by it just the same. The ink dried and held. Spring leaned in for good. Shivergrove woke in thin green leaves, shaking like coins on a day the wind had money to spend. Jonah watered the young trees from a bucket that had learned both chores and celebration. The roots took hold with a private persistence and sent word up the white trunks. The porch steps wore a track in the middle from feet that did not hesitate to come and go. Nights returned to their own shape. The river stone went into the oven before dusk. When the room took the chill, Nora wrapped the stone and slid it to the foot of Wren's little bed. Heat wandered up and stole into the curve of a calf or the soft place behind a knee, the way comfort finds a body when no one is watching. Wren sighed in her sleep as if a question had been answered to her satisfaction. In the shed, Nora wrote on the slate with confidence that did not show off. Her voice carried only as far as each child needed. The readers on the shelf were few, then more than enough. Jonah had planned each board until his fingerprints lived in the grain. He carved a little bird into the bottom of the first bench and did not tell anyone where to look. The children found it anyway, because children find what you think is yours to hide. On a late afternoon, the frame on the kitchen wall caught the sun and sent it back in a quiet square. The county form with Nora's letters settled, and dark had gathered the same dust as the mantle and was wiped with the same cloth. It looked like it had always been there. Nora stood under Shivergrove Wren against her shoulder, the baby's breath warm and milk sweet. The leaves took the shallow wind and made a sound like clapping far away. Jonah came from the barn with sawdust in his hair and set a hand to the small of Nora's back. They watched the yard together in the way of people who do not need to announce that they are watching the same thing. Inside, the music box finished its tune. The house, patched and tended, settled a fraction deeper on its stones. The peg rail held names that owned their place. The ledger waited for whatever ink would come next, not impatient, only available. The sign by the shed door lifted and fell as the air moved through, and each time it landed, the screws made a tiny content sound. Night drew up soft. Lamps found their height. The riverstone went where it belonged. Jonah checked the latch and set the bolt. Nora laid Wren down and covered her feet with the edge of a quilt that had finally learned the shape of a child. The aspen leaves talked among themselves in the dark and agreed on nothing except the pleasure of moving. Jonah set his palm over the blanket where Wren's feet made a small ridge. Nora looked at him and did not need to put a question into words. He smiled a line you could miss if you were not close. He whispered a single word that had done a lot of work already. Stay. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.